All right, hello everyone. So I'm really excited to introduce Ben and David to you all today. For those of you who don't know them, they run sort of this niche business podcast. It's a few-hour episodes. Pretty cool. At this point, everyone probably knows Ben and David, especially after the Chase Center event. Congrats on all of that success. Getting Mark in person, that's pretty amazing. And we've been really, really lucky to partner with Acquired for the last couple of years. Show of hands, who's heard our ads on the Acquired podcast in the last couple of years? Yeah, there we go. That's the justification for ROI right there. Don't tell Ronnie. Cool, so we're doing this panel today. We called it Process Power, which is a little bit of a pun on one of the best business strategy books of all time, 7 Powers. But we're going to dive deep into how Ben and David actually create the Acquired podcast and their process for doing research and generating the episodes.
So if you could just cut the recordings, because this is all trade secret, that would be great. Just kidding.
Well, you got enough brand power now that I think the mode is still there. Cool, so let's start at the beginning. So your first episode ever, Pixar, 2015, recorded in the Madrona offices. If I have done my research correctly.
Correct.
Nice. What was that process like? How did you make that very first episode?
Well, it took us, 8 months, I think, to make that episode?
Yeah,
that was the longest we've ever worked on an episode.
Well, we didn't work on it. That was the issue. There's an email thread saying, great having drinks last night. I'm in for this podcast thing. In February, and then we released the episode in October, and there's not a lot of email traffic about it in between. So the process was, we said, let's do it after work, and you and I finished work around 5, and we gave ourselves an hour-ish to prepare. So we sat down with our laptops to record, and we said, let's take an hour and first make sure we actually have the details of this right, and then around 6 we hit record, and then we recorded for 41 minutes, and then we shipped it.
And I think I have no idea if any of the stuff in there is correct. We make sure the details are right, but I'm pretty sure for at least the first 15 or so episodes, we were just making stuff up.
Well, we weren't making stuff up, but we were we were not doing hard work the way we do now to verify every little detail.
Certainly not.
So what were you reading for that hour? Was it just anything you could find, Wikipedia pages? What was the research material at the very beginning?
I think we had both probably read Ed's book.
Yes,
right?
Creativity Inc. But it had been a while. It's not like we did that to prepare for the episode. So we had I would say David and I were aware of everything that the general tech and media savvy audience was aware of. And then we probably brushed up by reading a few articles each. And then we were great, yeah, we've got the gist of this. Let's hit record. And I think at that point in time, it was we believed that our job to be done was translating a reasonably well-known set of public facts into our format, which is analyzing why the acquisition was valuable to the acquirer and then grading it relative to all possible acquisitions that could happen.
Yeah, if you listen to those first couple episodes, the history and facts were 5 minutes. It was we just okay, we're just gonna basically open up Wikipedia, get some baseline facts.
So
and
Pixar's
then
a company that does animated with computers.
Yeah. Yeah, there was no story. There was no very different.
Okay, so an hour of prep, 8 months of wind up, hit record the episode. Take us to today. What does that look like today for you when you create a new episode of Acquired?
It's a 24/7 obsession for at least a month, usually 2 or 3 months, because we kind of know what the next few are, and we're sort of researching in the background with the given topic, with uncovering every detail we possibly can directly from the source, the person, the email thread, whatever it is, finding primary research. And most importantly, making sure that we see the forest through the trees. So we open every one of our background research conversations with 2 questions. One is, what is the most misunderstood thing in the general public about this company? Our goal here is to sort of right the record on, the true essence of the company. And then 2, we sort of ask the question, why do you think this company worked? and at such great scale that it did work. And just hearing people who are involved in creating the company, hearing their answers to that question is always fascinating because they're not all the same, but they do provide a lot of insight into why those closest to it believed it worked.
And also, the topic today is process power. Something that Ben and I talk about a lot, but I think most people who listen to the show still don't realize. We prepare mostly separately. So we sort of each have our own process. In some ways they're similar, in some ways they're different. And we communicate a lot leading up to recording, but we do not talk about the details. We don't talk about points we want to make. We don't talk about what each of our belief is about what the core essence of a company is or why it worked. And so when we come together on recording day, that's all like a fresh, vibrant discussion. And we decided early on that if we didn't do that, it would sound like like a rehearsed, stilted kind of thing.
Yeah, you can only have an authentic first reaction once.
Yeah, makes sense. There's a lot of interesting points you just made about your process, so I'll kind of ask follow-up questions about each of them. So those first two questions, when did you stumble upon those as the fundamental question that you were trying to answer in each of these recordings? Because I assume that wasn't, episode 15, you realize like, oh, these are the right questions. Like I assume over time those emerged as sort of the themes, but how did that happen?
Those are questions we ask folks when we're doing research calls. I don't know, to a certain extent they're part of the goal of the episode, but I think really the goal of every episode is to create a canonical, fully contained piece about that given company. And obviously it's done at a moment in time, and things will happen afterwards that need updates. But as of that moment in time, we really want it to be like, if you want to understand the essence of this company and why it worked, this is the place to go to do it. And also be entertained and hear a great story along the way.
To directly answer your question, I think we figured out to ask what is the most misunderstood thing about the company about 2 years ago, and then sometime in the last year we really started asking, why did company X work? And I think it actually boils down the essence of what we do so much that I've even toyed around, like, should we change the intro to the show instead of, what is it, the podcast about
stories and playbooks. Yeah.
Stories of great companies and the histories and play. Anyway, I don't have my script in front of me. It really feels like actually what we're setting out to do is over the next 4 hours, we will try to unpack from raw material, why did the company work? And I think the companies we cover are so phenomenally successful that there's actually very little you can learn from them today. Like if you go just read a bunch of articles about Big Co today, and then you try to apply literally anything to your startup, it's probably going to be such a lossy application that it's not even worth it. So the most useful thing to do, I think, is understand when that company was your size, what are the things that made it work? And I think that's actually the hard thing to answer, because it's difficult to go find an article about Meta from 2006 when their growth had stalled. Like, did people in the room know this? In 2006, Facebook stopped growing. It was flatlining before they did the open registration. And they tried a whole bunch of things that didn't work before they said, I guess open registration. And these things are kind of lost to history, but they're the most useful as people are building their businesses today.
Yeah, I certainly experienced that with the Microsoft episode. There's so many parallels, well, hopefully between Microsoft and Statsig long term, but just, building this software platform and, kind of the approaches that they took. And you resonate with so many of these early decisions where you're like, they did not know what they were doing. They were just trying things and hoping it worked out. And then some of the stuff stuck. And it's like, okay, great. We're just like Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. Like that, that feels great. So it's very reassuring. So one other process component, the monthly cadence. How did you settle on that? Because that feels like a very unintuitive decision from the perspective of a content producer, where probably the advice you got was, produce more often, produce shorter form. So how did you settle on this format of monthly releases of the podcast, long form, hours long, and why is a month the right amount of time to prep everything that you need for that long form conversation?
What we used to do much more frequently and much shorter. And I think the real answer, honestly, is that as we started doing longer, every time we went longer, every time we went deeper, every time we did more work, it would be better received. And as we started doing that, we just like fundamentally hit bandwidth constraints. Like it wasn't like we were like, oh, monthly's the right cadence. We were like, our lives are going to fall apart if we keep making, 24 of these a year or something like that. So monthly, we just sort of landed on like, okay, this is the right balance of lets us make episodes to at least approximating the quality bar that we want. We always want them to be better. Every time we release an episode, we're like, damn it.
New bar.
Well, oh, damn it, that new bar. But also, like, I always feel like there's stuff we should have done better. We could have done better.
Yeah.
Like every episode, we're just like, oh, God, I'm sort of embarrassed by this. But within a month is the right time frame of like, okay, we can get close enough.
There's also something really important about being disconnected from the news cycle. I think a lot of media tries to, I recently learned this phrase, news peg, tries to hang their content on a news peg. And when you do that, from the moment you have the idea until your piece is live, there's like a ticking time bomb in your life where it's like, gotta get it out, gotta get it out. And it just ruins quality because you start prioritizing timeliness over quality. And so at some point we figured out, wait, if we disconnect from the news cycle, and our goal is not to be like irrelevant, our goal is to be timely but timeless, that you can listen to that years later and it still has just as great of a value. Once you disconnect from that news cycle, then you can really think about what is in our view the highest quality thing that we can make that exists about the essence of this company, and then how long do we need to create that? We sort of back into the 1 month thing from the ideal quality that we want.
We also, as you know, disconnected our business model from the number of episodes that we release. I mean, it's loosely connected. You can't avoid it to some degree, but most other shows, content creators, whether traditional media or new media, whatever amount of content they release, they sell like that amount of content. We have partnerships that last a season, and it's about way more than just the episodes. So that freed us up to say, like, okay, to make the highest quality stuff, which will be best for everyone, best for us, best for our partners, what's the right cadence here?
Yeah. Within that monthly period, how do you structure your time? So what does the research process look like in week 1 versus week 2 versus week 3? And do you have sort of structured phases that you plan ahead of time, or is it more organic where you hit a milestone and then you realize, okay, now it's time to move on to the next phase of research?
This is where you and I do two completely different things. So maybe go through a month in the life of David, and then I'll do a month in the life of Ben.
Great. Yeah, I expect it. I'm curious to hear what your process will be. Oh gosh, for me, like, I operate the same as I did when I was in college. Of every episode is a term paper, or maybe more like a thesis these days, and it just operates on the same cycle for me as it did back in college. Of like, okay, as soon as you finish one, you're like, okay, all right, now I can attend to like some of the other stuff in my life.
There's like 2 or 3 days of
need
downtime.
Attending to. Yeah, a little bit of time, and then it's sort of a slow ramp up from that to by the end of the month. For me, I find I need to write out a script, which is not word for word, but like pretty close. Like if you were to look at like a movie dialogue script and just strip out all except one person, like a movie dialogue script for one character, I write something pretty close to that. And it looks like, 30 to 60 pages worth of text. And I find that for me, that's like the best way to organize all the information, be able to think about it narratively like a story, make sure I have it all there, and then just sort of be prepared, because as I'm writing it in sort of like how I would speak, it's sort of like that's my rehearsal. Even though we're going to say totally different words when we come together, that allows me for that day that we're spending recording, like, okay, I don't need to worry about, what I'm going to say. It's already in there.
Can I ask just a couple quick follow-up questions on that? So one, where are you writing? Like, is this your laptop? Are you at a coffee shop? Are you at your desk at home? Like, what's your writing setup as you're going through this?
Yeah, so, this gets a little bit into the research. So my writing setup is almost always at home, on my laptop in Apple Notes is where I do this. And then I will actually...
Very sophisticated.
Yes. And then when I say pages, I actually check. So as we get closer to record date, I copy all my text from Apple Notes into Microsoft Word to get a page count and a word count, just so that I can kind of compare where's, like, what volume of content do I have here versus other episodes? How is this gonna, like, stack up? Am I like way under prepared, way over prepared, etc.?
And there's usually some point where David will text me his page count and be like, ugh, this episode's going to be a total mess. The longest we've ever done is, for reference, was 55 pages. Now we're at 65 pages, and I still have this other section to do. I get this text basically every time.
Every time.
But like, how do you go earlier? Like,
yeah. Okay, so this is why.
What do you do in week one?
So this is why I say it's all back in college. So I was a French literature major in college, and I wrote term papers, I wrote junior papers, and I wrote a senior thesis. And the research process was physical hardcover books, physical books, and making notes in them, both underlining, starring, writing notes in the margins. I still do that. Like, that is my primary note-taking process for existing material. And then for our calls, I'm taking detailed, sort of like journalist reporter type notes on all the calls that we're doing either separately or together.
And we used to do 0, and on Microsoft Volume 2, we did 25.
Yeah, so that's becoming much, much more over time of the sort of share of research that we do. When I write the script, I then go back, the physical books, stack on my desk, and then notes from those calls, and then any online resources too from my notes. And I'm going through those notes, and I'm essentially retyping them all into an organization of, like, the script in a language, in a story that I would want to tell them.
And you create these chapters, because David at some point shares with me, he's like, here's the 7 to 9 chapters of the story.
The narrative structure of the
story. So I
story.
at least get the chapter headers of, like, here's what David's thinking in terms of the eras of the company.
Got it. And I was going to ask about that too. So you pre-structure kind of chapters or volumes ahead of time, or
Yes.
Okay, got it.
I do. This is all just my side. Once we get together, it doesn't always go according to my plan.
Yeah.
There's like whole chapters that get thrown out where as we're recording, we're like, oh God, we haven't made enough progress in the story yet. It's dragging. The hook from this part is actually like going to pay off way later. So we need to would you be open to taking this 20 years and putting it in 2 sentences instead of everything else you wrote out? And like that has to happen, but you kind of have to, you have to feel it. Like you have to be recording to be like, I wouldn't have been able to tell you ahead of time, but this part's got to go.
Totally. And I've tried to adapt that now earlier into the process of, I used to think it was obligatory to get everything in there, all the facts as it went. And now I've realized the Lockheed Martin episode was a turning point for me on this. So this whole thing that is sort of important, but just it didn't fit in the narrative structure. Yeah. So now I try to think ahead of time of for these chapters and for the volume of content on each, what is the narrative dramatic arc that we're telling here? And how does this all fit into that structure?
Awesome. Ben, your process?
I'll be shorter because it's
Sorry about that.
Similar but happens in a vacuum. I also try and watch, we interviewed Mark Zuckerberg a few weeks ago, and I watched 30 of. I try to watch every interview you possibly could that's with Mark on YouTube to prepare. Our next episode is going to be Meta. That's going to come in awfully useful. What my process looks like, similar at Apple Notes, big mess, huge, long, scrolly thing of just copying and pasting out of pieces that I read. I actually also really like reading equity research reports on the company today, and then seeing if I can find their initiating research, the first time that they did a research report on the company. And a cool thing that has happened now that our audience has grown is people who run long-only equity funds will often ping us and say, hey, what's your next episode? Let me see if I've done research on it. So I have 200-page PDFs right now of equity research analysts that tried to do their own history of meta and then like it's proprietary. They use this and they just keep it at the firm, and it informs the new hires that come in about whether they want to change a position that they have. And so we get to use that as like, wow, someone's already, I get to take other people's synthesis of why the company worked and then resynthesize it with all the raw data. So I do a lot of that. I think I do more than you do of reading the big PDFs that people send us these days of the like, in case it's helpful with your research.
Yeah, it's funny. I intentionally don't read any of it. Partially because I know that's what you're bringing to the show.
There you go.
No, and I don't want it to bias, my view of what I think the narrative should be.
Yeah, and we find it's helpful to just have different raw data will create two different points of view, which ends up being helpful on air. The thing that I do that's quite different is I will come into recording day with like a pretty scarce structure of like the timeline, but I'll have 5-ish points that I want to make, kind of playbook themes, whether they happen in playbook or whether they happen earlier. A great example is the miracle that is the SR-71, or the tapestry that is Costco's low SKU count translating into all the magical things that happen downstream from that.
Scale economy is shared.
Yeah, that is written word for word. And so that's kind of like a pre-rehearsed, and we're looking, like I'm listening for David's story, looking for the hook of like, all right, here's where I can do the thing that I think is going to be a really exciting moment for listeners.
Is that why you always start the ad spots?
Do I really?
No, we've just always had the structure where Ben's sort of the host. You've always been the top of the show.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened. It's almost like welcome to my show. Thank you for preparing all the research for it.
That's awesome.
I'm very glad that you do it because, I always get so nervous when we come into recording day. Like the fact that you kick things off, like, is just a huge burden off of me, and I appreciate so much because I'm like, oh, Ben's got this, great. And then you start it off, you've got your intro, and they're like, all right, we're in it, let's go.
Yeah, I think if there's a structure guy and a wild card, that's the.
Well, it's almost, yeah, it almost works both ways because David is structuring the story, the narrative. He is the broad structure, and then you're structuring like that conversation. It sounds like,
yeah,
which is very complimentary.
During the story, it's almost as if you're the play-by-play and I'm the color commentator.
Yeah, but meta, you're the play-by-play, and I'm the we have our own unique roles.
And for the acquired business, I mean, there's many ways in which I am sort of the COO. Like, there's a lot of details that I'm mired in, and David often has these really good ideas because a lot of times you're divorced from the details. So you actually can be like, we're thinking about this all wrong. I had this great idea in the shower. And like, it often is a great idea.
Ben is the equivalent of the StatSig user in
Yes.
acquired business.
Love that. Okay, one thing that's interesting, and last question I'll ask on process, and then do a quick lightning round with a few other questions. You sort of have a cornered resource now as an additional source of power, which is these access to interviews and then things like this research from, private equity firms that are writing reports for you, or I've heard mention of all of the unique sources that you now have access to because you occupy this position. How has that changed your process from where you started to where you are today? And how have you woven access to these, like, a 4-hour interview with Steve Ballmer into this research and preparation process as you built these episodes?
It's motivated by fear. So I'll just start with that. Like,
Very healthy.
Let's just where's the waterfall for it come from? The more people listen, the more afraid I am of getting literally anything wrong. So it used to be, let's make sure I get the broad story right. Now I'm like, every number has to be right because the protagonist is going to listen, or the person that has the most intelligently formulated counter-argument to why I'm about to say is also listening, and we will also hear from them via email. And so a lot of it is me sort of trying to figure out how to make sure we have the most bulletproof thing after we release the episode to justify everything that we said.
And I feel exactly the same way in terms of the story too. I don't want anybody to listen who lived some or all of what we're talking about to feel like, well, that didn't capture the spirit of what it was.
Yeah, like you talk to any Apple executives and you bring up the Walter Isaacson book and they're like, ugh, they blew it. He blew it.
Yeah.
And like that is my worst nightmare of me. Like the reason we study these businesses is because we're in awe of them. There are these huge outliers in humanity, these monuments that are created, for better or for worse. I think that's implicit. But I never want to do wrong by the people who built that thing that is a monument in our world. And so I think that a lot of it now is just turning over every stone to make sure I don't get the email of like, you actually missed the most important thing. And that's why I want to read all these different perspectives, because I want to see what other smart people think the most important thing is.
Yeah, absolutely. I also imagine, just as a business nerd, for lack of a better term, being able to talk to Steve Ballmer about the early days of Microsoft must just be the coolest thing in the whole world.
It's so fun.
So fun.
Yeah. And as we've grown too, and there's some reputation around it, people get more candid with us too. Like we got together with Steve the other night, and he's like, here's a very reasonable criticism of my tenure, and here's the thing that I think actually people, that's a dumb criticism, but this one, really legitimate criticism.
Yeah. That's awesome. All right. So research and storytelling are a huge part of everyone here's jobs. You could be a tech executive, you could be a PM, you could be a VC, you could be an engineer. And interestingly, between both of you, you've literally had all of those titles I think I just named. So you've had a pretty cool path to podcast superstar. What skills have you mastered at Acquired that would have been most useful for you when you were a VC or a PM or even an engineer? And which ones should people in the audience practice if they want to get better about telling stories about products or companies, or even just convincing their engineering team to work on the specific product?
Everything is storytelling. The only way that people get convinced to do anything, like implement your feature, is storytelling. So I wasted a lot of text in feature specs when I was working at Microsoft, writing out something that didn't form a cohesive story. And so I think understanding, like every Acquired episode is a hero's journey. It is this person with a grand idea facing extreme adversity, overcoming that adversity, being right against all odds, and then, how it shows up in our world today in a recognizable way. Even though it started in unrecognizable obscurity, we ended in a place where you're very familiar with it. And I think it doesn't have to be that narrative structure, but just thinking about when I'm doing any sort of business writing for someone else in my company, what is the narrative journey that I want to take people on would be hugely helpful.
So one of my very favorite talks and videos ever was Don Valentine's View from the Top at Stanford GSB in 2010. I think he did it. And for those who don't know, Don Valentine founded Sequoia Capital. He was at National Semiconductor, I think, head of sales before that. He really founded the modern venture capital and startup industry as we know it today. And in that talk, he says something to the effect of everything is a story. And he says money flows as a function of the story. And yes, like everything. Humans operate on stories. Data is obviously super, super, super important. But convincing somebody requires a story.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ben and David. I think we learned a lot about process power today, and really appreciate you working with us and being here. Give it up for Ben and David.
Thank you.